Let me be perfectly clear. I do not recognize the authority of this court. Your laws do not apply to me.
Have you ever wondered what happens when a person who truly believes they are above the law, who thinks they exist outside the very fabric of society, walks into a room where judicial power is absolute? In the world of viral courtroom dramas, there is a specific type of defendant that represents a judge's greatest psychological challenge: the sovereign citizen. They arm themselves with pseudo-legal theories, believing that a specific combination of nonsensical words and red-inked seals can magically dissolve the authority of the state. But on this particular morning in my courtroom, one such individual was about to learn a lesson that no fake legal manual could ever teach: the brutal, unyielding weight of submission to reality. Picture the scene. It was exactly 9:15 a.m. The courtroom was packed to capacity, yet the air carried a vibration of unnatural tension. In the third row sat a man named Garrett, about 45 years old, wearing a look of practiced, extreme defiance. He didn't have a lawyer. Instead, he clutched a mountain of paperwork, covered in bizarre handwritten notes and thumbprints in red ink. Garrett didn't view himself as a defendant. He viewed himself as a high-ranking diplomatic entity being unlawfully detained by a foreign corporation. He scanned the room with a smirk of pure condescension, as if everyone else, the officers, the clerks, and myself, were merely actors in a game he had already mastered. In my 40 years of wielding the gavel, I have learned a fundamental truth. The loudest people in the room are usually the most terrified. They use chaos to mask an inner vacuum. When I called his name, Garrett didn't just walk to the podium. He marched. He brought with him an aura of toxic arrogance. He didn't bow, he didn't nod, and he certainly didn't show respect. He slammed his stack of papers onto the mahogany desk and stared directly into my eyes, searching for a sign of weakness. I am a living man, a flesh and blood soul, not a corporate fiction for you to adjudicate, Garrett began, his voice shrill and forced, cutting through the silence of the gallery. I do not consent to these proceedings. I do not recognize the jurisdiction of this administrative court over my sovereign person. I am here by special appearance only to demand my immediate release. I didn't offer a rebuttal. I didn't even glance at his pile of nonsensical documents. Instead, I slowly removed my glasses, placed them on the polished wood of the bench, and gave Garrett what I call the gaze of reality. In that moment, I wasn't just looking at him, I was dissecting him. I didn't see a hero standing up for liberty. I saw a man using a linguistic shield to hide from the consequences of his own reckless actions. Garrett had been arrested for driving without a license, without registration, and for a violent verbal assault on a public officer. He believed that by declaring himself sovereign, he could make those crimes vanish into thin air. The courtroom held its breath. People are used to seeing judges lose their patience, shouting or arguing with people like Garrett. But I chose the weapon of silence. I gave him a silence so long and so heavy that the air began to feel thick. I watched his fingers begin to twitch. I saw his eyes start to dart around the room. He was prepared for a verbal war, but he was entirely unprepared for a psychological crushing. Garrett, I finally said, my voice low, steady, and quiet enough that the entire room had to lean forward to hear me. In this room, the rules do not depend on your beliefs. They depend on the reality of judicial power. You may believe you are a king in your own mind, but when you cross that threshold, you became a defendant facing justice, and your show has just been canceled. The true collision between delusion and authority was only beginning. Garrett had no idea that his own arrogance was a trap, one that no amount of pseudo-legal gibberish could help him escape. Garrett didn't flinch when I told him his show was canceled. Instead, his smirk deepened, morphing into a look of pity, as if I were the one who didn't understand the rules of the game. He reached into his stack of papers and pulled out a document laminated in plastic, covered in bizarre red ink stamps and gold foil seals. He held it up like a holy relic, a shield he believed was impenetrable. Your Honor, or should I say, administrator of this private vessel, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a rehearsed, rhythmic cadence. I have filed a notice of default and a fee schedule with your clerk. By speaking to me, you have entered into a private contract. Every minute you detain the real person, Garrett, you are accruing a debt of $10,000 in gold bullion. Do you have the bond to back up this proceeding? Or are we operating under maritime law today? The gallery behind him remained frozen. I watched the people in the front row, a young couple waiting for a small claims hearing, look at each other with wide, confused eyes. They were witnessing a man try to cast a magic spell in a court of law. Garrett wasn't just speaking, he was performing a ritual. He believed that if he said the right magic words, the walls of the courtroom would dissolve, the handcuffs would vanish, and he would walk out a free man. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish his entire 3-minute script about common law, strawmen, and capital letters. Silence, as I've told you before, is a scalpel. By letting him speak, I was allowing him to sharpen the very blade I would use to dismantle him. Every word he spoke was a record of his refusal to acknowledge the social contract. He was documenting his own intentional defiance of the community's safety. "Are you finished, Garrett?" I asked when he finally paused to take a breath, his face flushed with the exertion of his own rhetoric. "I am the beneficiary of the trust. I am not the defendant," he shouted, slamming his hand onto the documents. I leaned forward, my shadow stretching across his laminated papers. "Garrett, let's talk about the real person for a moment. Does the real person require oxygen to breathe? Does the real person occupy physical space in the seat of a motor vehicle? Because the real person I see on the police report was traveling at 70 miles per hour through a school zone without a piece of plastic known as a license. You talk about maritime law and vessels, but you were on a paved road, endangering children who exist in the real world, not in your red ink fantasy." I watched his eyes. The smirk flickered. For a split second, the sovereign mask slipped, and I saw a glimpse of the terrified man underneath the man who realized that his gold foil seals wouldn't stop a jail cell door from locking. He tried to reclaim his ground by shuffling his papers, but his hands were shaking. He was realizing that in this room, the only law that mattered was the one I was about to execute. "You brought a fee schedule to my court," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like thunder. "But you forgot to account for the price of my time. And your debt to this court is about to become very, very expensive." Garrett's reaction was instinctive. When a man's internal map of the world is challenged by a superior force, he doesn't retreat. He doubles down on the very thing that is failing him. He reached for a second document, a writ of quo warranto, or some other pseudo-legal jargon he'd printed from a dark corner of the internet. The paper was trembling in his hand. I noticed a smudge of red ink on his thumb, a literal bloodstain of his own ideology. To him, this paper was a shield. To me, it was a confession of intellectual bankruptcy. "You have no delegated authority," Garrett shouted, his voice cracking, losing that rhythmic, rehearsed quality. "This court is a corporate entity. Look at the flag behind you. It has gold fringe. That makes this a military admiralty court. And I am a peaceful non-combatant on the land. You are committing an act of war against a sovereign soul." The gold fringe argument. It is the holy grail of the sovereign citizen delusion. They believe that a decorative border on a piece of cloth can magically suspend the penal code of the state. I watched the gallery. A few people were suppressedly laughing, but most were just staring in a kind of horrified fascination. They were watching a man drown in a sea of his own making, clutching a paper anchor. I didn't argue about the flag. Arguing with a delusion only validates it. Instead, I used the cold, hard logic of the physical world. I leaned back, my chair creaking with a sound that seemed to echo like a closing prison door. "Garrett, let's test your theory," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic shouting like a cold blade. "You say you are a soul and not a person. You say that the name on this citation, the name in all capital letters, is a corporate fiction that has nothing to do with you. Is that correct?" "That is correct." Garrett puffed out his chest, thinking he had finally trapped me in his linguistic web. "That is a strawman. I am the authorized representative, but I am not that entity." "Splendid," I replied, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "Officer Miller, if the person listed on this citation is a fiction and is not present in this room, then the vehicle currently sitting in the impound lot, the one registered to that fiction, has no owner. Since no person exists to claim it, I want you to authorize the city to have that vehicle crushed for scrap metal immediately. After all, a soul has no need for a 3-ton piece of steel, and the fiction isn't here to complain." The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett's jaw literally dropped. The mountain of paperwork he was holding suddenly looked very small and very useless. He had spent years learning how to argue that he wasn't a person to avoid a fine, but he had never considered that if he wasn't a person, he had no right to his property. His paper shield hadn't just failed to protect him, it had become the very weapon I used to strip him of everything he valued. Wait, you can't do that, he stammered, the sovereign persona evaporating into thin air. Why not, Garrett? I asked, my gaze pinning him to the spot. In your world, the rules are whatever you write in red ink. In my world, the rules are written in the blood, sweat, and tears of a society that agrees to live together. You can't have the protection of the law while claiming you are exempt from it. Now, are you the person who owns that car, or should I call the scrapyard? The silence that followed my threat to scrap his vehicle was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a man who had just realized his sovereign status didn't include a teleportation device. Garrett's eyes darted toward the exit, then back to his pile of papers, and finally up at me. For the first time, I didn't see a smug revolutionary. I saw a man who was suddenly, painfully aware of the four walls surrounding him. You can't scrap it, Garrett finally stammered, his voice losing its artificial baritone. There is a commercial lien on that property. I have a private security agreement. You are interfering with a private contract. There it was, the word contract. In the fractured mind of a sovereign citizen, the entire world is a giant terms of service agreement that they can simply choose to decline. They believe that if they don't consent to the law ceases to exist. It is a psychological defense mechanism, a way to reclaim a sense of power in a world that feels increasingly complex and indifferent to their individual desires. They want the benefits of the paved roads, the protected borders, and the emergency services, but they want to opt out of the bill. Garrett, let's clear up a fundamental misunderstanding, I said, leaning forward until the shadows of the bench obscured my eyes. The law of this land is not a contract that you signed at birth. It is not a subscription service that you can cancel because you don't like the programming. It is the baseline reality of living in a civilized society. You don't consent to the red light. You stop because if you don't, people die. I watched him try to find a rebuttal in his notice of default. He was flipping through the pages so fast I could hear the paper crinkling through the microphone. He was looking for the magic sentence that would make me go away. This is what I call the script paralysis. When these individuals are confronted with a judge who doesn't argue their gibberish but instead applies it to their own detriment, they don't know how to improvise. They are actors who have lost their place in the play. You are trying to treat this courtroom like a boardroom, I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, rhythmic pulse. You think you can send me a fee schedule, and suddenly I owe you money for doing my job. But tell me, Garrett, if I am just a corporate administrator, and this is just a private vessel, who is going to stop the bailiff from taking you into custody right now? If there is no law here, then there is no protection for you either. You are arguing yourself into a very dangerous void. I looked at the gallery. I saw a veteran in the second row, a man who had spent his life defending the very Constitution Garrett was currently mocking. The look on that veteran's face was one of pure, quiet disgust. Garrett wasn't just being annoying. He was being an insult to everyone who actually sacrificed to keep the social contract alive. Officer Miller, I said, not taking my eyes off Garrett. The defendant seems to believe that he is a non-combatant on the land. Let's see how his sovereign soul handles the physical reality of a standard judicial order. Garrett, you have 2 minutes to decide. Are you the person who is going to pay the fines for endangering a school zone? Or are you the soul that is going to watch his vessel get turned into a cube of scrap metal? The smirk was gone. The papers were a mess. Garrett was finally standing on the edge of the abyss, and for the first time, he realized that his paper shield was made of nothing but air. Garrett was hyperventilating now. The rhythmic, robotic chanting of legal codes had been replaced by the raw, ragged sound of a man who realized his magic spells had failed to ward off the monster. He looked at his stack of papers as if they had betrayed him. For months, he had likely sat in online forums with other sovereign believers, being told that these documents were a suit of armor. Now, under the cold lights of my courtroom, he was realizing they were made of nothing but wet cardboard. And Danjing, I strip you of your immunity, Garrett suddenly screamed, his voice hitting a desperate, jagged high note. He pointed a trembling finger at me. I am firing you. You are fired as the administrator of this account. I order the bailiff to take you into custody for treason against a sovereign soul. I am the judge of this proceeding now. I am the court. I watched him with the same clinical detachment a scientist might use to observe a dying star. This is the terminal desperation phase. When the pseudo-legal script fails, the sovereign citizen often attempts to invert the power structure. They try to arrest the judge, fire the court, or declare themselves the supreme authority of the room. It is a pathetic display of psychological displacement. They cannot accept a reality where they are subject to rules, so they attempt to create a new reality where they are the lawgiver. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I let his scream echo off the marble walls until it died a lonely death in the heavy air of the gallery. Garrett, I said, my voice so quiet it forced him to stop panting just to hear me. You are trying to fire a mountain for being in your way. You are trying to arrest the tide for getting your feet wet. It is a fascinating display of theatrical delusion, but it has zero impact on the physical reality of these proceedings. I leaned over the bench, my eyes locking onto his with a predatory focus. You just committed another crime in open court, obstruction of justice, and attempted interference with a judicial officer. You think you are firing me? Garrett, I am not your employee. I am the manifestation of the community's will to remain civilized. I am the barrier between you and the chaos you wish to invite. You don't have the power to fire the law any more than you have the power to fire gravity. I looked at Officer Miller. The bailiff shifted his weight, his leather gear creaking a sound that, in this room, is far more meaningful than any writ of quo warranto. Garrett's gaze snapped to the handcuffs on Miller's belt. The cold, metallic reality of those cuffs was doing more to dismantle his ideology than 1,000 legal textbooks ever could. You have spent so much time living in the universal commercial code that you forgot about the universal code of consequences, I continued. You are not a judge, Garrett. You are a man who has run out of script. And since you've decided to try and arrest the court, I think it's time we show you what a real arrest feels like. The panic in his eyes was absolute. He clutched his papers to his chest like a security blanket, but his knees were beginning to buckle. The sovereign was falling, and the citizen was all that remained. The room didn't just go silent, it went frozen. Garrett's arm was still outstretched, his finger still pointing at me in a gesture of failed command. He was waiting for the universe to align with his words. He was waiting for Officer Miller to step forward and arrest me. But the universe doesn't run on red-inked delusions. It runs on the weight of institutional authority. When Miller didn't move toward me, but instead took a step toward Garrett, the man's face went from a defiant red to a sickly, translucent white. Officer Miller, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. The defendant has declared this proceeding a private vessel, and himself the judge. Since he no longer wishes to participate in the reality of this court, perhaps he would prefer the reality of a holding cell. Secure him. This is the moment of the physical awakening. For a sovereign citizen, their entire world is constructed of language. They believe that if they can control the words, they can control the outcome. But handcuffs don't speak. They don't care about maritime law, or strawmen, or capital letters. They are made of cold, forged steel, and their only purpose is to remind the wearer that they are, indeed, subject to the physical laws of the state. As Miller reached for Garrett's wrist, the sovereign finally snapped. He jerked back, clutching his pile of papers to his chest like a holy relic. Don't touch me. I am a private entity. You are committing battery. I have a fee schedule of $1 million for any unauthorized physical contact. I watched his eyes. They were wide, dilated, and darting. This was no longer a legal debate. It was a cornered animal. Realizing the cage was closing, narcissists of this type are terrified of physical restraint because it is the ultimate proof of their powerlessness. You can argue with a judge, you can ignore a fine, but you cannot decline the physics of a metal cuff ratcheting around your bone. Garrett, I said, leaning over the bench so far that my shadow completely engulfed his frantic movements. Every time you shout a price, you are simply proving how much you fear the truth. You aren't a king. You aren't a sovereign. You are a man who endangered children in a school zone and then tried to hide behind a dictionary. The soul you keep talking about is about to spend the next few hours in a room where the only thing that matters is the iron door. Miller moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who has seen 1,000 Garretts. With one swift motion, he secured Garrett's right arm. The sound, the sharp, rhythmic click, click, click of the cuffs, was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of the fantasy finally dying. Garrett let out a sound that wasn't a word. It was a high-pitched whimper, a total collapse of the ego. His writ of quo warranto slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor, landing in the dust near the bailiff's boots. I sat back, my face an unreadable mask of stone. Take him down, officer. Let him contemplate his notice of default in a cell that doesn't accept gold bullion for rent. We will reconvene when the defendant is ready to speak the language of the real world. As Garrett was led away, his heels dragging slightly on the linoleum, the gallery was deathly quiet. They had just watched a man's entire identity be erased not by an argument, but by the simple, cold application of authority. The vessel had been boarded, and the captain was in chains. The room was held in a state of suspended animation. The sharp, metallic echo of the handcuffs ratcheting shut had acted like a physical weight, pinning everyone to their seats. Garrett stood there, his arms forced behind his back, his body slumped in a way that suggested the very bones of his sovereign identity had turned to water. On the floor, his mountain of red-inked paperwork lay scattered, a chaotic mess of useless wood pulp that had failed to stop the inevitable march of the law. "Look at the floor, Garrett," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a winter chill. "Look at the contracts and the fee schedules. You spent so much time preparing. In your world, those papers were a fortress. You believed that if you stacked enough nonsensical words on top of each other, you could build a wall high enough to keep reality out. But look at them now. They are just litter on a courtroom floor. This is the phase of the trial I call the psychological autopsy. It is the moment where I peel back the layers of a defendant's delusion to show them the rotting core beneath." Garrett wasn't just a man who didn't want to pay a ticket. He was a legal parasite. He wanted the protection of the police he insulted. He wanted the safety of the roads he turned into a private racing strip. He wanted the benefits of a civilization he refused to acknowledge. He wanted to live in a house built by the community, while claiming he didn't have to follow the blueprints. "You called yourself a non-combatant on the land," I continued, leaning forward until I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "But the reality is far uglier. You are a man who is terrified of being ordinary. You adopted this sovereign ideology because it made you feel special. It gave you the illusion that you were the only one who knew the secret rules of the game. It allowed you to look down on the honest citizens in this gallery, people who pay their taxes, follow the speed limits, and respect their neighbors as if they were sheep, and you were the shepherd." I looked out at the gallery. I saw the veteran from the second row again. He was sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Garrett with a cold, unrelenting judgment. That veteran didn't need magic words to be a man of honor. He had earned it through sacrifice. Garrett, on the other hand, was trying to steal dignity through a dictionary. "The ideology you subscribe to is a poison, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to a low, rhythmic pulse. "It tells you that the social contract is a trap, but the truth is, the social contract is the only thing that keeps us from the abyss. When you declare yourself sovereign, you aren't declaring independence. You are declaring war on your neighbors. You are saying that your convenience is more important than their lives. You are saying that a school zone is just a suggestion for a god like you." Garrett tried to speak, his lips moving in a silent, desperate tremor, but the script was gone. The strawman was dead. All that was left was a middle-aged man in handcuffs, realizing that he had gambled his freedom on a stack of lies and lost. "You told me you were firing the court," I reminded him, my gaze pinning him to the spot. "But you can't fire the truth, Garrett. And the truth is that you are a citizen of this state, subject to the laws of this state, and you are about to discover that the administrative vessel you mocked is the only thing standing between you and a very long, very quiet stay in a cell." The dismantling was complete. The ego was shattered. Now, there was only the final stroke of the gavel. I looked down at the scattered remains of Garrett's paperwork. These documents, once held with such arrogant conviction, were now nothing more than a tripping hazard for the bailiff. Garrett himself was no longer a sovereign soul. He was a man in handcuffs, his chest heaving, his eyes finally grounded in the gray reality of the courtroom floor. The psychological war was over. The rebellion had been crushed, not by a louder shout, but by the quiet, unyielding weight of the law. "Garrett," I said, my voice resonating with a finality that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. "You came here today to perform a miracle. You wanted to turn a courtroom into a theater and a judge into a servant. You spent months memorizing a script that promised you a world without consequences. But as you stand there now, feeling the cold steel on your wrists, I want you to ask yourself, was the fantasy worth the reality?" I reached for my gavel, my fingers closing around the worn wood. "On the charges of reckless endangerment in a school zone and driving without a valid license or registration, I am imposing the maximum statutory fines. But your true crime today was the contempt you showed for the very people who share this world with you. You treated the safety of children as an administrative choice and the authority of this court as a private contract. For the obstruction of justice and your repeated attempts to subvert these proceedings, I am sentencing you to 30 days in the county jail to be served immediately." Garrett let out a strangled breath, but he didn't fight. The fire was gone. He looked at Officer Miller, waiting for the next command. He had finally accepted the only contract that matters, the one where actions have consequences. "Officer Miller," I commanded, "remove the defendant. And see to it that those papers on the floor are disposed of. They have no value here, and they have no value in the world outside." As the side door opened and Garrett was led away, his footsteps echoing a lonely, rhythmic beat, I turned my attention to the gallery. I saw the faces of the people who live in the real world, the people who follow the rules, not because they are sheep, but because they understand that mutual respect is the only thing that keeps us from tearing each other apart. "To those of you remaining," I said, my voice softening but retaining its granite core, "let this be a reminder. Authority is not a magic trick, and justice is not a debate. We live together under a shared set of rules because without them, there is no freedom. There is only the chaos of the loudest voice. In this courtroom and in this country, we are all equals before the law. No red ink, no gold fringe, and no secret script will ever change that." I looked at the veteran in the second row. He gave a single, slow nod of approval. The balance of the room had been restored. The authority of the community had been reclaimed. I raised the gavel and brought it down with a sharp, singular strike that signaled the end of the delusion. "Case closed."